I record this as I stand upon the ash-choked plains of Xiphos 9, a forge world once teeming with the ceaseless hum of industry. Now it groans with a sound that is neither mechanical nor natural, a resonance that shakes the teeth and rattles the skull. I am Dominus Valric of the Adeptus Mechanicus, tasked with assessing an anomaly of unprecedented severity. Our landing craft disgorged our small cadre into a landscape lit by furnaces that belch a violet smoke into a sky thick with charged ash. The first impossible fact I must report: the planetary engines, the vast lattice of cogitators, turbines, and plasma conduits that should have been silent, are broadcasting tonal patterns intelligible only to the machine spirit. And yet, we hear them. Not just hear, but feel. A vibration through sinew and bone, through marrow, resonating with a cadence older than any litany. From the moment we stepped onto the surface, reality fractured. Gravimetric readings fluctuated erratically. Sometimes we felt heavier than our own armor should allow. Sometimes weightless, as if the planet itself were shaking us free of our corporeal bonds. Thermocouples reported negative temperatures, even in proximity to molten slag. I cannot explain it, though I have spent decades within the sanctums of Mars, interfacing with machines that could cleave reality at their whim. Yet this is different. It is deliberate, intelligent, possessed. Our initial reconnaissance into the lower engine complex was blocked by a localized electromagnetic pulse that snuffed out servitor lights and scorched optic lenses. The anomaly seemed to anticipate our movement. Servitors, normally stoic and unfeeling, recoiled as though repelled by an invisible hand. As we forced entry through secondary maintenance hatches, I noted faint markings along the conduit walls, spirals of corrosion forming hexagonal patterns, faintly glowing in the low light. They vibrated when touched, like a pulse encoded into the very metal. The air itself carries a metallic tang, heavy with the scent of ozone and burnt lubricant. Every inhalation tastes of iron and ash, and beneath it all, I sense a whisper, low and almost imperceptible, a sequence of clicks and hums, rising and falling in a rhythm that mimics speech. I cannot decipher its meaning, yet I feel compelled to listen, to obey. Corpsmen and tech priests alike note unease in their hearts. Brother Jareth, assigned to monitor the cogitator feed, paused mid-step, eyes unblinking, as if observing a phantom visible only to him. He murmured fragments of a liturgy I do not recall teaching, words in low Gothic twisted beyond recognition, syllables broken, yet somehow resonant with the hum of the engines. I logged the event, noting increased stress markers in his vitals. As we approached the central interface chamber, a sight emerged that froze the marrow. The main cogitator, normally inert without command, displayed a human-shaped silhouette, shifting subtly among the cables and conduits. It moved with independent will, as if aware of our scrutiny, yet it was formed entirely of machine components. Pistons for limbs, hydraulic conduits for sinew, glowing coils for eyes. A living diagram of fusion between flesh and engine. I raised a comm to Adeptus Mechanicus HQ to report the finding, but transmission faltered mid-syllable, warping into a staccato of static clicks. Instruments spun into chaos. Gravimetric meters swung violently. Thermoregulators oscillated, and the vibration through my boots intensified to a painful resonance. The tech adepts shouted warnings, but there was no discernible source of danger, yet the danger was palpable. Short bursts of observation reveal more anomalies. Lubricant flows upward against gravity. Pressure valves emit tones in perfect consonance with the harmonic pattern of the planetary engines. Servitors twitch, seemingly aware of events we cannot perceive, their movements synchronized with the unholy melody of the machine. I perform a scan with my own ocular implants. The silhouette flickers across the interface, duplicating, splitting, yet always maintaining the same impossible form. It watches us as much as we watch it. I note the recurring hexagonal patterns carved into the walls. Previously inert, they now pulse in rhythm with the core engine hum. Each pulse is a heartbeat, a summons, a warning. Time itself becomes uncertain. What should have been a 15-minute inspection stretches into an hour of subjective experience. I document the irregularities clinically. The pulse of the engine seems to slow and accelerate independent of physical causality. Communications to HQ remain disrupted. The air feels charged with expectation, a prelude to calamity. Finally, as we attempt to retreat for analysis, a commotion erupts. A maintenance hatch, previously locked, swings open violently. A surge of cold air mixed with metallic stench rushes outward. From within, the silhouette steps forth, leaving the cogitator interface entirely. Its limbs articulate like hydraulic pistons. Its eyes glow with the inner fire of warp resonance. The crew freezes in terror. Instruments fail. The ground beneath the hatch trembles, as if the planet itself were expelling an intruder. The chapter closes with a single, horrifying fact. The figure does not walk. It glides, impossibly, both in the physical corridor and within the cogitator feed simultaneously. And the last telemetry reading before all systems fail shows a distorted command. We remember you. We are cut off, alone. And already the planetary engines roar in anticipation. The corridor ahead of us shifted as if alive. I record this with the precision of a tech priest, though my hands tremble over the console. I am Dominus Valric, and what we witnessed last is only the beginning. The humanoid silhouette that emerged from the cogitator interface yesterday now stalks our perception, even in its absence. I note with clinical detachment. The crew reports seeing limbs fused with pistons and hydraulic tubing where bone should be. At first, I believed it a hallucination induced by fatigue, or perhaps the lingering resonance of the planetary engines. But multiple independent observations confirm the phenomenon. Objective, documented, undeniable. We proceeded deeper into the engine complex, past corridors lined with heat-stained conduits and corroded maintenance panels. Small anomalies became unavoidable. Hydraulic fluid flowed against gravity, and localized temperature spikes burned the air around us, though instruments registered nothing. Servitors, normally compliant, twitched erratically. Their optical sensors reflected images that did not exist. One servitor, designated MK4 Service, attempted to repair a conduit, but instead began to tear into its own chassis, as if following instructions whispered by the machine itself. The most alarming sign was the appearance of symbols etched into the metallic walls. I record them. Interlocking triangles overlaid with circles, spirals converging into points, harmonic glyphs. When touched, these markings vibrated subtly, as if alive. Each vibration emitted a tone, a note that resonated through bone, not air. I ran the readings through my own implants and observed the harmonic frequencies match patterns emerging from the planetary engine's anomalous broadcast. The numbers repeat, 71342, 71342, always in that sequence. Short sensory events punctuate our descent. The metallic tang of scorched lubricant, the vibration of conduit walls against the palm, the almost imperceptible whispers emanating from nowhere. Crew members cannot ignore them. Brother Jareth collapses to the floor, muttering fragments of a liturgy that seems encoded in machine language. He speaks in low Gothic, yet the syllables correspond to harmonic frequencies detected in the cogitator feed. It is ritual and technical phenomenon entwined, proof that the machine and warp converge here. Our investigation reveals the first casualty of the mission. Servitor MKVIDELTA was pulled into a massive rotating spindle while monitoring a heat vent. The body should have been mangled. Instead, sensors report a duplication anomaly. The same servitor appears simultaneously in the maintenance corridor and within the cogitator interface, a partial manifestation in both physical and digital realms. We cannot retrieve it. All attempts to re-establish communication with HQ remain futile. Their telemetry is corrupted by harmonic interference. We are left to document anomalies ourselves. I note environmental changes with every step. Gravitational fluxes make locomotion erratic. Heat spikes rise and fall unpredictably. Metal walls seem to hum with resonance that shifts the visual perception of depth. Crew members are visibly shaken. Scribe Tovian records, "The engines see us. They are aware, and they are impatient." I do not disagree. At one junction, a short comms update breaks through, barely, audible over the rumble. "Dominus! If you hear this, do not proceed. Containment. Failing. System unstable." Then static consumes the signal. The warning is clear. What lies ahead is beyond conventional hazard protocols. The deeper we descend, the more pervasive the corruption of body and mind becomes. Minor crew members display copper-veined skin, ocular implants reflecting cogitator readings rather than reality, and voices replaced with mechanical drone. Sensory layering intensifies. The smell of burnt circuitry and flesh, vibrations through the armor that mimic heartbeat, whispers that alternate between harmonic tones and fractured speech. Patterns repeat. Hexagons carved into floors now glow, spiraling with every pulse of the planetary engines. I record each with meticulous care, aware that these motifs are a language or a map or both. We reach the first major junction to the lower engine heart. Here, environmental hazards escalate, gravity flux intensifies, hydrothermal vents emit acidic mists, and conduits pulse with static electricity that lashes across the floor. The harmonic hum of the planetary engines is omnipresent. Short, sharp sensory strikes punctuate long, expository descriptions. The hiss of escaping gas, the sharp metallic clang of a valve snapping, and the wet, slithering sound of something moving behind the walls. Then we see it again. The silhouette, no, the form, appears not where it should. It moves with impossible articulation, limbs bending beyond human limits, pistons for bone, cables for tendons, hydraulic fluid for blood. It is aware, calculating, predatory. Crew members flinch, trying to maintain formation. One tech adept is caught staring too long and convulses violently, muttering machine code as though possessed by the harmonic resonance. Micro cliffhanger. The silhouette vanishes, only to leave behind a small servitor fused with engine tubing, eyes glowing with inner fire, watching us. The hybrid creature moves independently, signaling the first real interaction between the anomaly and our mission. Macro cliffhanger. As we press forward, telemetry shows a previously unmapped shaft leading directly into the planet's core, pulsing with harmonic resonance far beyond anything recorded in Mechanicus history. I log this with extreme caution. Should we continue, we may confront a level of corruption and sentience beyond even our understanding. Yet there is no turning back. The planetary engines roar with expectation, their harmonic pulse growing stronger, more deliberate. Every sensory spike, every anomaly, every death and corruption leads to this inevitable convergence. The world itself seems to bend toward the heart of the anomaly, and we are drawn into it, compelled by duty, curiosity, and dread. We advance, knowing that what awaits is not merely mechanical, not merely warp-tainted, but a fusion of flesh, machinery, and sentience beyond comprehension. The planetary engines watch, and we cannot escape the rhythm of their roar. I set my hands upon the cogitator altar, its surface vibrating like the skin of a living thing. The steel was cold, but beneath it I felt the pulse of something not mechanical, something breathing. I, Dominus Valric, record this with full awareness that my words may condemn me, for communion with the machine has never before carried such dread. The planetary engines whisper, not metaphorically, not by corrupted code or random interference. They whisper as though they know my name. I engage direct interface through my cranial mechadendrites, patching neural impulse to the cogitator array. Instantly, My mind was flooded with light and sound, data streams crashing like tidal waves, vox chatter stretching backward and forward in time, fragments of litanies spoken in voices not of this galaxy. At first it was chaos, but gradually, as if to test my endurance, it arranged itself into words. They were not spoken in Low Gothic, nor in Binharic, but in a tongue that felt remembered. Words carved into the root of consciousness itself. The engine remembers. The engine requires. The engine hungers. Crew around me heard nothing. To them, I appeared still, eyes rolled back, cables humming with current. Yet I was elsewhere, walking corridors of light where geometric shapes spiraled infinitely, each shape humming its own liturgy. I saw hexagons within hexagons, rotating in harmonic resonance, glowing with colors outside mortal spectrum. The pattern of 7-13-42 repeated endlessly, stamped upon the walls, encoded in the pulse of my own heart. And then I saw them. Faces, hundreds of faces, human and not, fused within conduits, staring through sockets replaced with optics that wept sparks. They chanted not in sorrow, but in reverence, as if they had chosen this fate willingly. One engine, one flesh, one hymn. I tore myself free before full assimilation could occur. My ocular implants blurred, flickering with after-images of those faces. The smell of ozone thickened, sparks danced across the console like restless spirits. I staggered back, recording every detail with what clarity remained. The others thought me shaken by overload, but they did not see what I saw. Yet in time, they began to feel it too. The whispers leaked beyond the cogitator. Tech adept Harl muttered machine code fragments while cleaning his rifle. Engineer Morian began striking his chest in rhythm with the harmonic hum. Unaware, his motions echoed the liturgy of the dead faces. Even the servitors showed signs of contamination, their optic lenses flickering in sequence, synchronizing to the 7-13-42 pattern. Then came the first true manifestation. A skeletal servitor stumbled from a maintenance hatch, half fused with turbine components. Its chest cavity contained a miniature engine, pistons pumping where lungs should be. Its eyes rotated like turbine fans, glowing with impossible light. It did not attack, nor speak. Instead, it bowed, mechanical limbs, folding into a parody of prayer, and then collapsed into sparks and ash. The sound it left behind was worse than any assault, a resonant hum that echoed the harmonic pattern, synchronizing perfectly with the planetary engine's broadcast. I documented every frequency, the numbers aligned, the glyphs carved into the metal walls, the spirals, the interlocking triangles were not random. They were an invocation, a ritual inscribed into the world itself. Each glyph corresponded to a tone, each tone to a number, each number to a sequence, and that sequence was being broadcast not just into the air, but into flesh, into thought. The deeper we went, the more impossible phenomena occurred. Sound arrived before sight, a clang heard seconds before a conduit split apart. Heat arrived after flame. One man described seeing himself walking the corridor moments before he did, a temporal echo created by harmonic distortion. Short sensory strikes interrupted the heavy detail, the tang of rusted iron, the sting of hot vapor against skin, the vibration of vox units rattling bone. My augmetics began to ache, as if being pulled magnetically toward the cogitator. The machine spirit was no longer passive. It sought communion, not by request, but by command. At 0420 hours, the cogitator emitted a burst of corrupted data. The vox screens showed brief flashes of a shaft descending into the planet's core, deeper than any map records. Its walls were lined with glowing glyphs, arranged like an inverted cathedral. For 7.13 seconds, the entire crew stood paralyzed, transfixed. Each man later described the same impossible detail. They saw themselves standing in that shaft, fused to its walls, chanting in voices not their own. I issued immediate orders for withdrawal to the surface for re-evaluation. Yet the engines resisted, doors sealed without command. Corridors warped, elongating, folding upon themselves. What should have been a 5-minute walk back to the surface stretched into an hour, with corridors repeating, stairwells leading in circles, shadows stretching unnaturally long. The environment itself had become complicit in our containment. Micro cliffhanger. During this entrapment, Scribe Tovian cried out. His shadow, cast upon the wall by our lumen strips, moved independently, twisting, its limbs elongating like pistons, its head crowned with glowing coils. The shadow turned to look at him, then it smiled. Macro cliffhanger. As we attempted to recalibrate our path, the cogitator lit anew. Across every screen, in binaric and harmonic code alike, appeared a single phrase: descent required. And from beneath us, through the very bones of the planet, came a vibration so deep, it rattled teeth loose. A call from the shaft that leads into the planet's core. The planetary engines no longer whisper. They command. And we are already obeying. The dawn of July 1856 crept slowly over the lonely cemetery of Withers Ridge, its pale light falling upon a place that no longer seemed holy. The air was heavy, damp with the scent of overturned earth, and the silence of the early morning was broken only by the faint whisper of cicadas. Yet for the townsfolk who gathered once more, there was no peace in this dawn, only dread. For the 13th time, the children of the Withers family were to be reburied. By now, the funerals had ceased to resemble ceremonies of grief. They were rituals, repeated with nervous hands and hollow prayers, each one layered upon the last with a weight of suspicion and whispered terror. Men who once scoffed at such tales now came armed with Holy Scripture in one hand and silver charms in the other. Women clutched rosaries until their knuckles turned white. Children were forbidden to even look toward the cemetery, lest the curse fix its gaze upon them next. The coffins were exhumed under the watch of trembling lanterns. When the earth gave way, the gravediggers froze. Once more, the bodies were not as they had been left. Soil clung to their faces as if they had risen in the night and clawed to breathe. Small fingers, pale and rigid, jutted upward as though reaching for the surface. Their eyes, those blackened pits that should have closed with death, appeared faintly open, swollen with dampness, and staring. No matter how firmly the coffins had been nailed shut, they were always found splintered. No matter how deeply the graves were dug, the children's remains seemed to shift and writhe toward the surface. The 13th exhumation left the town in silence for nearly an hour, as though none dared to speak aloud the thing all had come to believe. The earth itself rejected the Withers children. Father Alonso, the parish priest, raised trembling hands over the open graves. His voice cracked as he recited prayers that had once steadied his flock, but which now seemed powerless. His Latin verses faltered, drowned beneath the weight of unease, as the bodies refused to rest. The faithful murmured, "Vampire, witchcraft, demon," their voices broken but certain. Some demanded the corpses be burned so that no trace of them would remain. Others begged that the children be carried far into the desert, buried where no man would stumble upon them again. But the Withers family, bound by grief and pride, resisted. "They are our children," the father insisted, though his voice quivered. "They will rest in consecrated ground as God wills it." So once again, the coffins were lowered into the soil. Thicker nails were hammered into the lids. Charcoal, salt, and holy water were poured into the earth before the graves were sealed. Father Alonso marked each mound with the cross, pressing his trembling fingers deep into the dirt. But as the last spade of soil was patted flat, a sound rippled through the crowd. It was faint, but unmistakable. A scratching. The earth seemed to stir, as if something beneath it still clawed, still fought against the weight of burial. The crowd recoiled in terror. Mothers covered their children's eyes. Men dropped their lanterns, and the cemetery filled with flickering shadows. The priest insisted it was the settling of earth, nothing more. But none believed him. By now, Faith had cracked. Fear had become the town's true religion. And in that silence, broken only by the imagined scratching of tiny nails beneath the soil, a dreadful certainty settled upon every heart. The Wither's children would never stay buried. The 13th reburial left the town shivering with fear. The whispers did not fade in the days that followed. They grew louder, darker, and more desperate. By now, every house in Wither's Hollow had its own tale of scratching in the night, of children's laughter echoing faintly through shuttered windows, of pale faces glimpsed in the reflection of glass. The curse of the Wither's children was no longer bound to the cemetery. It had seeped into the very marrow of the town. It was the blacksmith, Hiram Cole, who spoke aloud what many had already thought, but dared not say. He stood in the town square at dusk, lantern in one hand, hammer in the other, and declared, "They must be burned. Their bones, their coffins, their very names must be turned to ash, else they will rise again, and we will all be damned." A silence fell heavy upon the crowd. The people looked to the Wither's parents, who sat hollow-eyed and gaunt, as though half dead themselves. The mother wept, pleading that her children remain whole, that their souls not be condemned to eternal ruin. But even she could not deny what her own eyes had seen: graves disturbed, coffins broken, bodies twisted as if still alive. That night, torches were lit. The townsfolk marched in procession to the graveyard, not as mourners, but as executioners. The firelight painted their faces in shades of fury and dread. Some carried axes, others iron stakes, and others still clutched holy books tight against their chests, whispering prayers as though they might hold back what they were about to unleash. The coffins were exhumed one final time. The wood was slick with rot, nails twisted from within as though by some inner strength. The smell of damp flesh choked the air. One by one, the coffins were dragged from the earth and laid in a grim circle upon the ground. The Wither's father fell to his knees, begging for mercy, but his words were drowned out by the priest's own trembling voice. Father Alonso lifted a torch high and called upon God to forgive them, to sanctify what must be done. Then, without another word, he cast the flame upon the first coffin. The fire took quickly. Dry wood cracked and screamed as it burned, and within moments the coffins were engulfed. The air filled with a hiss, like breath being drawn through teeth, as the fire licked across the remains. And then came the sound no man would forget, the piercing wail, high and thin, rising from the flames. It was not the groan of burning timber, nor the crack of splitting nails. It was the cry of a child. Some dropped their torches and fled into the night, unable to bear what they heard. Others pressed on, feeding the flames, forcing themselves to believe it was nothing more than fire and memory. Yet the cries grew louder, overlapping, the voices of many children shrieking in terror, in rage, in something that was not entirely human. When the fire finally guttered to ash, the silence was worse than the screams. All that remained were blackened fragments of bone, cracked and brittle. The priest ordered the ashes to be scattered, divided into the four winds, so that never again would they gather in one place. Men with trembling hands carried urns of ash into the desert, others into the river, and some to the far hills. But even as the last embers died, unease clung to them. Some swore they saw the ashes drift against the wind, swirling upward like smoke returning to the sky. Others claimed they felt the ground tremble, faint and hungry, as though the soil itself mourned what had been stolen from it. The townsfolk had believed fire would bring peace, but in the hollow silence of that night, with the scent of charred flesh still thick in their throats, a darker thought crept into every heart. What if fire had not destroyed the Wither's children, but freed them? The burning should have ended it. That was the comfort the townsfolk clung to as they lay awake in their beds the night after the fire, their nostrils still filled with the stench of smoke and scorched flesh. But no one truly slept. The silence was too deep, the darkness too still. They had cast the ashes to the winds, believing dispersal would bring peace, yet even the most hardened among them, carried the sense that something had been loosed instead of destroyed. At dawn, when the first light touched the edges of Wither's Hollow, strange signs began to appear. The desert wind, which should have scattered the ashes far, blew inward instead, curling toward the town in great black spirals. Ash collected along doorsteps and windowsills, though no one had carried it back. The footprints of children, small and sharp, appeared in the dust outside the chapel, leading up to the heavy oak doors, and stopping. Father Alonso found them first, his hands trembling as he traced the indentations with his fingers. By mid-morning, the cattle in Hiram Cole's field had been found dead, their bodies stiff and their eyes blackened as though burned from within. There were no flames, no smoke, only the stench of char and a thin ring of ash encircling each carcass. Hiram swore he had heard laughter in the dark before dawn, faint and mocking, as though children played among the shadows of his barn. The townsfolk gathered again, desperate for answers. Some whispered that the burning had cursed them further, that the children's spirits had been bound not to rest, but to roam. Others argued that scattering the ashes had invited them everywhere at once. And then came the story that turned dread into panic. A young girl, Mary Sullivan, no more than 6 years old, had been found in her bed at first light, alive, but pale and cold, her hair streaked with soot. When her mother asked what had happened, the girl only whispered, "They came last night. They said I could play with them. They said they wanted me to come to the graveyard." Her mother tried to hush her, but the girl went on, describing children with hollow eyes and voices like smoke, their hands blackened as if made from burned bone. They had climbed through the cracks in the walls, she said, whispering her name, tugging at her nightdress, pulling her toward the door until she screamed. The town fell into chaos. Mothers would not let their children out of sight. Men patrolled the streets at night with lanterns and rifles, though their hands shook when they held them. No one trusted the silence anymore, for it seemed that silence itself now had a heartbeat. And yet the sightings spread. A shopkeeper swore he saw a boy standing in the reflection of his store window, though no one was behind him. A rancher awoke to the sound of weeping and found ash smeared in handprints across his door. Every story carried the same chilling detail. The children were not gone. They were walking among them, drawn back from ash into form, but not the forms they once had. By the end of the week, Wither's Hollow was no longer a town of the living, but of the waiting. Waiting for the laughter to return. Waiting for the footsteps at the door. Waiting for the Wither's children, who had died 13 times, burned and scattered, yet still found their way home. The fire had not ended the curse. It had given it breath. The people of Wither's Hollow had lived with dread for weeks. The children's ashes had not stayed scattered. Their laughter still danced in the wind, and their footprints appeared where no living child had walked. Yet until now, fear had been the only thing that had spread. Fear and sleeplessness. But all curses demand their first blood. It came on a night when the moon was hidden behind heavy clouds. The streets lay empty except for the occasional lantern swaying on a post. In the Cole household, Hiram Cole, already a man broken by the sight of his cattle burned from the inside, tried to keep watch over his family. He had kept his rifle beside the door, oil lamp lit, though the flame guttered with every draught that whispered through the cracks in the house. His wife, Esther, urged him to sleep, but Hiram refused. It was near midnight when it began. The first sign was the sound of a lullaby, soft, faint, drifting through the wooden walls of the house. Esther froze, recognizing the tune, though she could not place how. It was the sort of melody mothers hummed to babies long ago, simple and steady, yet it carried a weight of sorrow that bent the air. Hiram stiffened and gripped his rifle. The sound grew louder. It was not outside, it was inside. Their daughter, little Rebecca, stirred in her bed, whimpering. Esther rushed to her, but before she reached the crib, the child sat upright and opened her mouth. The lullaby was coming from her throat, but it was not her voice. The sound was layered, dozens of tones at once, like many children whisper singing through her mouth. Her eyes rolled white, her small hands twitching as if pulling invisible strings. Esther screamed, clutching Rebecca, shaking her to silence her. But the lullaby did not stop. It grew stronger. And then the ashes came. From the cracks in the floorboards, from the chimney, from the very seams of the windows, fine black ash seeped into the room. It swirled in the air, gathering, shaping. Small forms emerged, indistinct but undeniable. The outlines of children, their features blurred, their hands black and skeletal. Their laughter now mingled with the lullaby, a chorus of death and play, echoing in the cramped wooden home. Hiram fired. The shot tore through one of the shapes, scattering it into drifting clouds, but before his eyes, the ashes curled back together, reforming. The child shape tilted its head at him, mocking, and stepped closer. Rebecca began to scream, not her own scream, but many, all at once. The windows shattered inward, lantern flames snuffed out. Darkness swallowed the house. The next morning, neighbours gathered at the sound of Esther's wails. The coal home was blackened as if smoke had poured through every room, though not a single flame had burned the timber. On the floor lay Hiram, his body rigid, his eyes burned black like his cattle's. His rifle was splintered in half beside him. Esther clutched Rebecca, rocking her back and forth, her hair wild, her lips murmuring prayers that made no sense. But Rebecca was silent, staring past everyone, her small mouth curved in a faint, unnatural smile. Ash clung to her lips like soot. The sheriff declared Hiram's death an accident, some freak misfire of his weapon, he said, though none believed it. The townsfolk knew. This was the first. The curse had claimed blood, and worse still, Rebecca had not cried again. For days, she did not speak. Until one evening, when she looked up at her mother with those wide, distant eyes and whispered words no child should ever know. They said it wasn't enough. They said more must burn. From that moment forward, Withers Hollow ceased being a town merely haunted. It became a town awaiting slaughter. By the time Hiram Cole's grave cooled beneath the August dirt, the town of Withers Hollow had already changed. It was no longer a quiet settlement of ranchers and farmers. It had become a place where no one dared to sleep with both eyes closed. The people whispered in hushed voices of the lullaby that had slithered through the Cole home, of Hiram's eyes turned black as pitch, of Rebecca's smile that never seemed to leave her lips. But more than whispers, there was a truth everyone could feel in their bones. The curse had grown stronger. The ash returns. It began in small ways. Ash drifting down chimneys, even when no fire had burned. Fine black dust collecting on dinner tables, though the air outside was clear. Children waking with soot beneath their fingernails and not remembering how it got there. Every family tried to explain it away. It's only the stove, some said. Only dirt from the fields, said others. But when old Mrs. Henley found her baby grandson asleep in his cradle, covered from head to toe in a grey-black coating, and the child's skin beneath was ice cold, excuses no longer mattered. The baby lived, but his cries never returned. From that night, the boy only hummed tuneless sounds in his sleep, the very same lullaby Esther Cole swore she had heard through her daughter's mouth. The town gathered at the church soon after, demanding answers. Reverend Matthew Crane, a man who had buried too many of his flock in shallow earth, tried to calm them. He said they were being tested. He said faith would hold them. But his words rang hollow when, mid-sermon, black motes began drifting down from the rafters, dusting the congregation's hair and shoulders. And then, the laughter came. Children's voices, faint at first, but growing louder, echoing against the wooden walls. Some covered their ears. Others bolted for the door. One woman collapsed, clutching her chest, muttering prayers until her tongue knotted in her throat. The Reverend ordered them to stay, to remain in the house of God, But even he faltered when the great cross hanging behind the pulpit began to tilt, as if pulled by unseen hands. Slowly, it turned upside down. The people fled screaming. The church was abandoned that night. It was never opened again. Rebecca speaks. Amid all of this, little Rebecca Cole grew stranger. She walked among the townspeople with her hair neatly tied, her hands folded in front of her dress. But her eyes, those eyes were wrong. Too still. Too knowing. And she began to speak in ways that chilled the blood. At first, she only whispered to her mother, simple phrases like, "They are outside. They are waiting for more. They like the dark." But soon, she spoke in front of others. When the blacksmith's forge went cold despite the roaring coals, Rebecca was there, murmuring, "They're learning how to take the heat." When cattle were found dead in their fields, their bodies twisted into impossible shapes, she said aloud, "They wanted to play, but the animals don't play right." And when the town elders tried to demand the truth from her, she simply looked at them with that empty smile and said, "They told me." 13 was never enough. Her words spread faster than the ash. The first mass panic. It was late September when the town finally broke. One morning, a thick fog rolled down from the hills, swallowing the town whole. In it, the people swore they saw the children, thin silhouettes running, skipping, dancing. Every window pane rattled with their voices, every well echoed with their whispers. Chickens clawed themselves bloody in their coops, horses bucked until they broke their own legs, dogs howled until their throats tore open. And then the bell tolled. The church bell, which no one had touched in weeks, began to ring by itself, slow, steady, each strike heavier than the last. The sound rolled over the fog like thunder. The people poured into the streets in terror. Families clutched one another. Men fired shots into the mist. Women wept. And through it all, the shapes of children moved in and out of sight, never fully seen, but always present. Rebecca stood in the square, barefoot, her white dress grey with soot. She tilted her head back, staring at the bell tower as if she were listening. And then she spoke, not to the people, but to the air around her. "Yes," she whispered. "I'll tell them." And when the bell stopped, Rebecca turned to the crowd, her voice carrying louder than any child should. "They want another burial." No one asked who they were. Everyone already knew. Breaking point. By nightfall, Withers Hollow was undone. Half the town packed wagons and fled down the valley roads, though none reached the neighbouring towns. Their carts were found days later, wheels burned black, horses dead in their harnesses. No bodies were recovered. The other half clung stubbornly to their homes, hoping the storm of evil would pass. But those who remained soon realized the truth. Leaving or staying did not matter. The ashes had chosen them all. Esther Cole tried to protect her daughter, but how does one protect a child who is no longer a child? Rebecca stopped eating. She stopped sleeping. Yet her small body never weakened. At night, her lips moved constantly, whispering to unseen companions, answering voices no one else could hear. Sometimes she laughed, and it was not her laugh. Sometimes she cried, and the sound was of dozens of children weeping through her throat. Esther begged the Reverend to save her daughter, but he only shook his head. He confessed that he had prayed until his voice broke, and each time the prayers were answered with mocking laughter. He said the curse was older than their faith, older than the valley itself. The 13th burial had not ended it. It had only fed it. The omen. That autumn night, when the last leaves fell from the trees, the people of Withers Hollow awoke to find a sign burned into the earth. In the meadow beyond the cemetery, the grass had blackened into a perfect circle. Inside it were 13 smaller circles of ash, each the size of a child's grave. And in the center, drawn in the dirt by a finger too small to be an adult's, were 3 words: "More must come." Rebecca was found sitting at the edge of the meadow, her hands covered in soot, humming softly to herself. The town understood then. The curse was not satisfied. The Wither's children had been buried 13 times, but 13 was only the beginning. The harvest moon rose red that night, casting its glow on a town no longer living, but waiting for who would be taken next. By late October, Wither's Hollow had become a town trapped between life and nightmare. Those who remained no longer moved with the measured pace of farmers and townsfolk. They moved like hunted animals, always listening for the soft crunch of ash beneath invisible feet, always watching shadows twist unnaturally in the corners of their eyes. The first full-scale attack came on a night the moon was hidden behind rolling clouds. The fog crept from the hills, thicker than ever before, curling through the streets and alleyways like sentient smoke. From within it came voices, childlike, echoing, carrying the same twisted lullaby that had first awoken in the coal house. But now the voices were many, hundreds at once, overlapping, growing louder, filling every corner of the town. The people had no time to gather weapons. The ash moved like water, seeping into homes through cracks in walls, drifting down chimneys, pouring in through doorways. Shapes began to take form. Small figures, gaunt, their faces pale as bone, their eyes black voids that reflected no light. Hands clawed at wood and stone, pulling themselves through even the narrowest gaps. They did not speak. They laughed. They whispered. They demanded attention. In the square, Rebecca Cole stood at the edge of the fog, her white dress grey with soot, her hair matted. Her lips moved without sound as the first of the shadows approached. And then she turned her head slowly toward the remaining townsfolk, her eyes wide, vacant, yet knowing everything. "They hunger," she said. By the time the people understood the words, it was too late. The shadows swarmed. Families were torn from their homes, dragged into the fog. Their screams carried down alleys and across fields. Those who fired rifles found the bullets pass through the shapes like smoke, leaving no mark. Lanterns splintered and died in mid-air, plunging the streets into near-total darkness. The Reverend tried to call them to prayer, but the voices of the children overrode his words. Hums, cries, whispers, each tone more discordant than the last, shook the walls of the church. He was thrown backward by a gust of wind. His collar, catching fire from a lantern, toppled onto his vestments. He rolled on the ground, choking, praying, but no salvation came. And then the first bodies were found. It was near the river, where a group of townsfolk had tried to escape by crossing in a small rowboat. The mist obscured everything, but the water itself seemed alive. Ash floated above its surface, swirling into forms, shapes like children's limbs reaching, grasping. The people in the boat were pulled overboard, dragged beneath the water. When the town recovered their bodies the next day, the corpses were pale, twisted unnaturally, and their eyes were gone, replaced by blackened hollows. The horror was spreading faster than anyone could flee. Houses were abandoned, livestock slaughtered, the fog moving into barns, into cellars, into every hollow space in the valley. Those who resisted were taken first, their bodies dismembered or fused with ash and debris, leaving only the faintest suggestion of their humanity. Rebecca walked through it all. Not a sound escaped her feet. The shadows followed her as if she were their queen. The townsfolk whispered that she was the conduit, that the 13th burial had bound her not as a victim, but as a herald of the curse. And every time she hummed, the shadows obeyed. By dawn, only a few dozen survivors remained, huddled in the old schoolhouse at the edge of the valley. The windows were boarded, the doors reinforced with iron, yet they could hear the soft tapping of small feet against the outside walls, and the whispers calling to them, naming them, tempting them. Father Alonso, among the survivors, spoke finally of a truth too terrible to ignore. The Wither's children were not merely restless spirits. They were something older, something bound to the valley itself, to the soil, to the ash. Every burial, Every attempt to destroy them had fed their power. Each death, each scattering of ashes, had been a ritual, unknowingly performed, and it had awakened them fully. By late morning, the survivors realized a further horror. The fog was retreating from the valley, spreading outward to the hills and woods, carrying with it the black ash and the children's laughter. What had begun as a local curse now threatened the surrounding lands. The survivors attempted to fight back. They gathered firebrands, knives, and rifles. They tried to burn the ash, to strike at the moving shadows, but every attack failed. The children were intangible, yet somehow felt every strike. Every attempt only drew more of the ash toward them. And then came the final, undeniable sign. Rebecca turned her head to them, her face still vacant, and whispered the words that chilled their souls beyond reason. They want more. They will come. The fog lifted only slightly, enough to see that the bodies of the dead had begun to move on their own, drawn together into grotesque parodies of life. They did not walk. They crawled, dragged themselves like ragged marionettes. Their eyes remained black hollows, and their mouths twisted into permanent, silent screams. The survivors understood that the valley itself had become a womb of death, and the Wither's children, now fully awakened, were harvesting it. By evening, Wither's Hollow was abandoned, its streets littered with the remnants of human life, its buildings hollowed, its fields blackened with ash. The few who fled would later tell tales of moving shadows in the fog, of small hands reaching from the earth, of laughter that echoed long after they had gone. The curse had escalated beyond the control of mortals. 13 burials had failed. The town had burned. The dead had walked, and the Withers' children were only beginning. The valley fell silent that night, but the sound of whispers carried on the wind, a promise of more to come. And somewhere in the thickest shadows, Rebecca stood, waiting, listening, her small mouth moving in silent communion with something older than the earth itself. The harvest of shadows had begun. The valley of Wither's Hollow had become a place no living soul dared to tread. Trees were stripped bare, their bark blackened and peeling as if scorched by some invisible flame. The grass was ash, brittle underfoot, and the river that ran through the valley had turned a sickly grey, as though it carried the curse itself in every drop. Yet despite the terror, a handful of the remaining survivors resolved to return. They believed that understanding the source of the curse, the ritual that had bound the Wither's children to the valley, was their only hope. Father Alonso led them, flanked by Reverend Crane and a few of the town's bravest men, armed with rifles, holy water, and iron stakes. Their progress was slow. The ash clung to their boots, blackening their skin and lungs. Every step carried the weight of silence, broken only by occasional whispers that seemed to echo from the fog itself. Rebecca led the way. She walked with unerring certainty, her small feet leaving no footprints, her dress streaked with soot. Her eyes, dark and distant, flickered to each survivor in turn, as if assessing whether they were worthy to witness what was to come. She did not speak, but the others could hear her hum, a sound that seemed to carry across the valley like an unseen choir. As they approached the center of the valley, the fog thickened. Shapes began to emerge from it, pale, skeletal forms of children, their mouths opening in silent screams. Ash swirled in the air, forming what looked like wings of smoke and dust around them. The survivors realized, with a sickening dread, that this was not merely a haunting. It was a gathering, a congregation of the dead, drawn together in anticipation of something far larger than themselves. Father Alonso stepped forward, clutching his crucifix. He began to chant prayers, his voice trembling but forceful. The air responded. The ash stirred violently, forming spirals that twisted toward him. The children's shadows moved in counterpoint, circling around Rebecca, who now stood at the center of a clearing. The clearing itself seemed unnatural. The earth beneath her feet blackened, grooved with geometric patterns that were impossibly precise, as though etched by something not of this world. Reverend Crane whispered to the others what he had feared. These patterns were ritualistic, older than the town, older than the valley itself. They were a map, a guide for awakening what had long lain dormant. Every burial, every scattering of ashes, had been feeding this ritual, and now, with Rebecca as the conduit, it was nearing completion. Suddenly, Rebecca lifted her arms. The ash around her lifted as well, forming a vortex that spun faster and faster. The air hummed with an otherworldly resonance. Those closest to her felt their bones vibrate, their hearts pound unnaturally. The surviving adults tried to intervene, sprinkling holy water, swinging stakes, shouting prayers. But the effect was negligible. The ritual was unstoppable. And then the choir began. It was not a sound any human could have produced on their own. Hundreds, perhaps thousands of voices layered together, whispers, laughter, cries, and a melody that resembled a lullaby, but carried with it something darker, something hungry. Each voice seemed to pierce the survivors' minds, showing them visions of their own deaths, of loved ones drawn into the ash, of the valley consumed entirely by blackened earth and skeletal children. Father Alonso fell to his knees, tears streaming down his face. He realized, with mounting horror, that the ritual had reached a tipping point. If it completed, the Wither's children would no longer be confined to the valley. They would emerge fully into the world, carried on the ash, bound by the chant, bound by Rebecca. The survivors tried one final act of defiance. They formed a circle around Rebecca, shouting prayers, brandishing fire, attempting to disrupt the geometry etched into the ground. The ash responded violently, lashing outward like tendrils, striking their weapons, singeing their clothing. One man was lifted from the ground, carried across the clearing before being thrown into a tree, his body broken. Others screamed as the ash enveloped their limbs, burning without flame, leaving only scorched flesh and bone. Rebecca did not cry. She did not scream. She only smiled. And then, as suddenly as it had begun, the air stilled. The ash froze mid-air. The choir of children went silent. The geometric patterns in the earth glowed faintly, a dull red, as though the ritual had reached a temporary pause. The survivors, panting, trembling, realized that they were still alive, for now. But the pause was brief. A whisper traveled through the ash, heard only by Rebecca. She nodded slightly, and the survivors saw the full truth for the first time. She was no longer a child. She was a vessel, a priestess of the ash, bound to the ritual in ways that no mortal mind could comprehend. And the pause in the ritual was merely the momentary silence before the final act, an act that would require another offering. The survivors understood. They had come seeking answers, but instead, they had found the full scale of the horror. The ritual was beyond their control. Rebecca was no longer a daughter, no longer a girl. They were witnessing the awakening of something older, something that had lain beneath the valley for centuries, waiting for 13 burials, for ash, for fire, and for the voices to call it forth. Father Alonso fell to the ground, clutching his crucifix. "God forgive us," he whispered, his voice barely audible. Rebecca's humming began again, soft and deliberate. And the survivors felt, deep in their bones, that the valley had not yet finished choosing its sacrifices. The ritual of the ashen choir had merely begun. The valley fell silent again, but not in peace. The wind carried the faintest echoes of the lullaby across the hills, promising that the Wither's children and Rebecca would not rest until the world itself had heard their song. The survivors fled, leaving the valley behind, but each step carried the weight of knowing that the ritual would continue, that the ash would spread, and that Rebecca, priestess of the dead, would carry the choir into every corner of the living world. The valley waited, the ash waited, the ritual waited, and the world would soon hear the first notes of the ashen choir. By early November, the survivors of Wither's Hollow were scattered, yet the terror they had witnessed did not stay confined to the valley. Those who fled carried the memory of the ash, the whispers, and the lullaby wherever they went. And unknowingly, they carried a seed of the curse with them. The first signs appeared in the neighbouring township of Ashwood. At first it was subtle, a thin layer of black dust coating the cobblestones after a heavy wind, children waking in the night with soot beneath their fingernails, strange shadows moving in the corner of every room. The town elders dismissed it at first. Just smoke from the furnaces, they said, a storm of dust, but the ash did not drift from the wind. It came from the east, from Withers Hollow, though no living person could trace its path. The arrival of the choir. It began at dusk, when the fog rolled in from the hills like a black tide. Parents called their children inside, bolted doors and windows, but the fog carried whispers that only children could hear. Small, insistent voices, sweet and coaxing, promising play, treats, laughter, yet the tone carried something unnatural, a hunger that no mortal mind could comprehend. By nightfall, several children had disappeared. Their beds were empty, doors ajar, ash clinging to the frames. Those who tried to follow the footprints, small skeletal impressions that seemed both real and unreal, found themselves walking into fog so thick it became a wall, swallowing sound, depth, and direction. Rebecca Cole had arrived, though no one saw her. She moved like a shadow among the fleeing children, her dress grey with soot, her hair unkempt but strangely composed. The children followed her willingly, drawn by her silent hum. She did not speak, yet the air around her vibrated with authority. She was no longer a girl. She was a conductor, orchestrating the ashen choir across the valley and into neighbouring towns. Panic and the first mass disappearance. By the second night, panic gripped Ashwood. Families barricaded themselves in homes, but doors and windows proved useless. The children had learned to move through cracks, through chimneys, through spaces no adult could squeeze into. Every home became a stage for the unseen ritual. Ash gathered in corners, drifting upward into vague, shifting forms. The survivors described glimpses of small hands, pale and skeletal, reaching for the living. The first mass disappearance occurred near the town square. A group of villagers had gathered, attempting to fend off the children with firebrands and improvised weapons. Their efforts were futile. The ash moved like water, reshaping itself into limbs, crawling over arms and legs, pulling the adults to the ground. The children, led by Rebecca, were at the centre, humming. It was no longer a lullaby, but a command, and the adults obeyed, dragged screaming into the fog. Their bodies vanished without trace, leaving only traces of ash behind. Those who escaped fled to the edge of town, only to find the fog expanding faster than the eye could follow. It moved with purpose, like a predator that could think. By dawn, entire streets were empty, homes abandoned, the sounds of life replaced by the whispers of the ashen choir and the soft, hollow laughter of children who should have been dead. The influence on the living Rebecca's power over the dead was clear, but she had begun to influence the living as well. Survivors reported that even adults who had not yet disappeared felt compelled to follow her commands. In isolated cases, parents led their own children into the fog, their eyes vacant, mouths murmuring the same lullaby that Rebecca hummed. Resistance only provoked terror, visions of children burning, rivers of ash rising to drown them, small hands reaching from beneath the earth. One man, Thomas Gren, tried to fight back. Armed with fire and holy water, he attempted to burn a small group of the children who had gathered near his barn. The children scattered, only to reassemble within moments, unscathed, their bodies reforming from ash as if no harm had touched them. The ash began to crawl over Thomas himself, searing without fire, burning yet leaving his body whole. He collapsed, screaming, and was carried off into the fog. No one saw him again. The townspeople realized something even more horrifying. The ashen choir was learning. Each time someone tried to resist, the children adapted. Their movements became more coordinated, their strategies more cruel. their forms shifting like smoke into shapes that tormented the senses. To witness them was to feel the laws of reality bending. Shadows moved independently of their owners. Whispers came from behind closed doors, and every corner of Ashwood seemed alive with anticipation. The expansion of the ritual Father Alonso, the last surviving priest from Withers Hollow, had followed the refugees into Ashwood. He tried to organize resistance, to confront the curse with faith and scripture, but the reality of the ritual overwhelmed him. Rebecca's humming now carried over miles, amplified through the ash, and reached the minds of the living. Her voice did not speak in words, but in commands. Bring the next offering, follow the song, submit. Those who survived Ashwood fled further, taking the ash with them, unknowingly spreading it across the countryside. Each new town would experience the same creeping terror, the fog, the whispers, the hollow laughter, and the inevitable disappearances. The Ashen Choir was no longer a local phenomenon. It was a spreading plague, moving with the inevitability of a slow tide, consuming one settlement after another. A moment of desperation. One survivor, Mary Beth Lorne, attempted to flee with her infant daughter, covering her with blankets and sealing herself inside a wagon. Yet when the fog caught up with them, she swore she saw small hands pushing through the blankets, her baby's cries transforming into hundreds of small, layered voices. Rebecca stood at the edge of the wagon, her small figure framed by black ash. The lullaby hummed through the fog, compelling Mary Beth to open the door. She did, and the child was gone before she could scream. Mary Beth's story, when later recounted to other survivors, carried the unmistakable truth. There was no safety in distance, no protection in flight. The ritual had broken the boundaries of space. The Ashen Choir could reach anywhere, through air, through ash, through memory itself. The valley waits. By the end of the chapter, Withers Hollow remained a silent, charred husk, yet the valley's influence spread like a slow contagion. Rebecca, standing in the center of the valley, hummed the Ashen Choir's melody. Every whisper carried a promise. The ritual was ongoing, unstoppable, expanding outward. The fog rolled over the hills like a black tide, a herald of what was to come. The children, once buried, once burned, once scattered, now marched in spectral armies, teaching the world the language of ash and lullaby. The survivors, scattered and terrified, could only hope for death before the next night, for no mortal weapon could halt the ritual. And in the center of it all, Rebecca smiled, a child and yet far older than time, as the Ashen Choir's song began to echo across the lands beyond Withers Hollow. The world would soon learn the meaning of 13 burials. By mid-November, the whispers had traveled far beyond Withers Hollow. Tales of children laughing in the fog, of blackened ash covering homes, of towns emptied in the night, reached the ears of those who had once doubted. Entire counties now trembled at the mention of the Ashen Choir, yet no one could understand its origin, its purpose, or the rules it followed. All they knew was that where the ash moved, life did not last. Father Alonso, the last surviving priest of Withers Hollow, had become a reluctant chronicler of the curse. Each night, he recorded the spread in meticulous detail, hoping some record might one day allow the Imperium or anyone to understand it. His writing was careful, but the tremor in his hand betrayed the terror he could not silence. "The valley speaks," he wrote one evening, "and its language is ash. It moves, listens, chooses. The child, Rebecca, is its voice, its priestess. I have witnessed what it demands, and it is neither mercy nor reason. It is harvest, ritual, and dominion. No prayer, no iron, no fire will stop it." The first contact. The curse moved silently at first, spreading into nearby villages. Travelers reported fog that rolled in unnatural patterns, ash that fell even when the wind was still, and the faintest whisper of the lullaby on open roads. Livestock perished in fields, crops blackened overnight, and children who had disappeared in one town appeared the next day, wandering silently in the streets of another, their eyes vacant, lips moving in hushed chants. It was in the small township of Grayfen that the choir revealed its full intent. On a night without stars, the fog descended upon the town like a suffocating tide. Rebecca appeared at its centre, pale and soot-streaked, her dress tattered but ceremonial, her hair flowing like shadows in the wind. Around her, shapes emerged from the fog, children in numbers beyond comprehension, pale and skeletal, their eyes hollow, their movements coordinated in eerie precision. The townsfolk tried to fight. They fired rifles, swung axes, lit torches. The children moved through solid walls, reformed instantly after being struck, and their laughter carried an unnatural weight, pressing down on hearts, bending wills. The air itself seemed to resist the living, thickening with ash, reducing visibility to mere feet, making direction meaningless. The choir had learned. Every act of defiance against them only strengthened the ritual. Every scream, every attempt to flee, added another layer to the ash, another note to the lullaby. Rebecca's humming dictated the rhythm of destruction. The town became a stage of ritual sacrifice, and the survivors understood the horrifying truth. They were not merely being killed, they were being incorporated into the ritual. The ash, as language father Alonso, had observed something in the patterns of the ash, something no one else could see. It was as though the ash itself spoke. It moved in geometric shapes, spiral patterns and glyphs older than any human civilization. To see it was to feel the valley's intent. It was counting, measuring, preparing. The 13 burials had been the opening notes. Now, with every town touched by the ashen choir, the valley was writing a symphony of death. Rebecca was the conductor. She did not command with words. Her voice hummed in frequencies felt more than heard. It entered the minds of the living, bending thoughts, whispering desires to the unconscious. Children followed willingly. Adults obeyed through terror. The ritual was teaching itself, adapting to each act of resistance, and Alonso realized that the choir would continue to evolve until the ash and its voices dominated every human settlement within reach. A glimmer of resistance. Not all were entirely lost. A small group of survivors, hardened by weeks of terror, began to strategize. Led by a man named Elias Thorne, a former militia sergeant, they attempted to trace the source of the ash to the valley itself. They believed that if Rebecca could be stopped, or the ritual interrupted at its origin, the expansion might be halted. Their journey was perilous. Every mile closer to Wither's Hollow brought thickening fog, burning ash, and whispers that gnawed at their sanity. At night, they could hear the choir's lullaby even within sealed wagons. Shadows flitted just beyond the lantern light, moving like children, sometimes just mimicking movement, other times reaching with skeletal hands, brushing against the living. Thorne documented each step, noting the patterns of the ash, its behavior, the way it seemed to gather toward the valley. They tried to strike at it with fire, holy water, and improvised explosives, but each attempt was futile. The ash reformed, more dense and more aggressive, as though learning from every strike. Rebecca remained central to it all, appearing in glimpses at the edge of fog banks, humming, observing, correcting. It became clear. She was not merely a puppet of the ritual, she was the ritual, the living voice through which the ashen choir commanded the valley. The valley awakens. Upon reaching the outskirts of Wither's Hollow, the survivors felt an unnatural silence. The valley was still, but tense, alive with anticipation. Black ash drifted upward, like smoke from a dead fire, forming towers, spirals, and glyphs in the wind. The trees bent unnaturally, forming archways that funneled the fog like a conduit. Then, from the center of the valley, a single note rang out, pure, low, resonant. Rebecca's hum became audible even to those previously immune, carried across the wind like a bell tolling doom. The ash moved as though alive, swirling into shapes that resembled the missing children, dancing, circling, converging. Alonso whispered, voice trembling, It waits. It knows we are here. It has been waiting for this moment, and now it will complete the next phase of its symphony. The survivors realized that they were no longer approaching a place. They were entering a mind, a consciousness, one older than the valley, bound to ash, lullaby, and death. Every step was measured, every breath observed. They were intruders in a ritual that existed outside time and reason, and the Ashen Choir's power was at its peak. The first fatal strike. Before they could take a single step into the clearing, the ash erupted in tendrils, striking with preternatural speed. One of the survivors, a young man named Samuel, was pulled into the air, screaming. His body was enshrouded by the ash, and when it fell, he was no longer human. His skin blackened, fused with ash, his limbs twisted into grotesque forms, yet he continued to move, crawling toward the group, eyes voids, mouth emitting a chorus of voices. The survivors fired upon him, but the bullets passed, through, as if through smoke. The rest of the choir swarmed, spectral figures emerging from fog banks, from the river, from the trees, all converging under Rebecca's silent command. It became clear, the valley, the Ashen Choir, and Rebecca were inseparable. The ritual was expanding, unstoppable, and every act of resistance only fueled its power. The Valley Speaks Father Alonso fell to his knees, chanting prayers that echoed into the fog, but the valley responded, not with words, but with whispers in the ash, a chorus that merged with Rebecca's hum. It was a language older than humanity, one that promised dominion over life, death, and memory. And as the survivors struggled to retreat, the valley began to pulse, as if alive, ready to draw them into the next phase of the ritual, the harvest of the living, beyond the valley itself. The Ashen Choir had become more than a local curse. It was a spreading force, a conscious symphony of ash and whispering children, led by a small, soot-streaked girl whose humanity had been erased. And the world beyond Wither's Hollow was listening, waiting for its first note. By December, the spread of the Ashen Choir had reached a pace no human authority could track. Entire counties were emptied in the night, roads were abandoned, towns deserted, and the countryside was coated in a pall of black ash that reflected the moonlight like a frozen sea. The lullaby that had begun in Wither's Hollow now travelled across miles of fog, carried in whispers, carried in dreams, carried in the wind. Father Alonso, now skeletal with exhaustion and fear, chronicled every report he could collect from the fleeing survivors. Ashwood, Grayfen, and countless unnamed villages had fallen. Entire families vanished into the fog, leaving homes standing, but empty, silent, coated in a black film of ash. Witnesses reported seeing children walk in patterns, geometric, deliberate, ritualistic, before being absorbed into swirling black smoke. Each disappearance added a new verse to the endless lullaby, and the ritual's influence grew with every lost soul. The choir expands. It was in the town of Harrow's Edge that the scale of the catastrophe became undeniable. Those who had escaped from previous towns tried to fortify the town with barricades, fire, and armed militias, but it was futile. The ash arrived like a tide, moving through cracks, rising in unnatural columns, drifting through windows. The children emerged from it in hundreds, their skeletal forms perfectly coordinated. Their eyes were voids, reflecting no light, their mouths twisted in endless silent cries. Rebecca stood at the center of the town square. She was no longer recognizable as a child. Her dress hung in tatters, blackened with soot, yet seemed ceremonial. Her hair flowed in unnatural waves, caught in an unseen current. She did not move. She did not speak. And yet her hum, the Ashen Choir's melody, commanded every living and unliving form within a mile. The militia fired upon the children, upon the ash, upon Rebecca herself. Bullets passed through the shapes as if through smoke. Flames that should have consumed them fizzled out, leaving only scorched air. Every attack only drew more of the choir forward. Those who resisted found themselves compelled, moving against their will, drawn into the fog by invisible hands, singing the lullaby involuntarily in their minds. The global reach. The Ashen Choir was no longer confined to the valley or the immediate surroundings. The fog carried the ash across rivers, through mountain passes, over plains. It infiltrated settlements in ways that no one could anticipate, through chimneys, cracks, wells, and the dreams of sleepers. Those who tried to flee found the ash waiting, patient, inexorable. It had become a force that moved faster than armies, stronger than weapons, and older than memory. In towns already touched by the curse, survivors reported seeing figures of the previously lost children appearing in new forms. Entire streets moved as if alive, reshaped by the ritual. Buildings shifted overnight, corridors elongating, doors opening into empty voids. The lullaby's notes had become physical, bending air and light, creating hallucinations of children everywhere. Panic consumed the population faster than the ash itself. The living harvested Rebecca had evolved. She no longer needed to lead the choir personally in every town. Through the ritual, she could send fragments of herself, whispers, visions, and small spectral children to distant settlements, compelling actions in her absence. Parents led children into the fog, willing and obedient, their minds broken by the lullaby's subtle commands. Soldiers fell on their knees mid-battle, consumed by visions of ash, while the choir continued its march. Father Alonso documented the horrors with trembling hands. Entire towns were vanishing in nights, leaving only smoke, ash, and echoing whispers. Survivors fled from one region to another, only to be intercepted by fog and shadows in multiple locations simultaneously. Communication systems failed, compasses spun erratically, and even the air seemed to resist direction, bending perception. The ritual had begun to warp not just space, but cognition itself. A glimpse of the ritual's logic. The geometric patterns that Alonso had observed in Wither's Hollow now appeared everywhere. Streets bent in spirals, rivers shifted unnaturally, flowing against their banks. Forests grew in perfect hexagonal grids. Ash collected in intricate formations, the shapes of children moving as one through every settlement. The ritual had a language, a logic, a purpose, to remake the world itself in the pattern of the choir. Alonso's notes reflected growing despair. The valley is no longer just a place, it is a mind, a consciousness. The ash is thought made visible, and Rebecca is its vessel. Every act of resistance adds to the symphony. Every human life is a note, every town a stanza, and the world will be composed into this melody, or cease to exist. The first regional collapse. Harrow's Edge became the epicenter of the first regional collapse. Those who tried to flee the town found bridges destroyed by shifting fog, forests reformed into impossible labyrinths, and roads looping back to where they began. The Ashen Choir moved as if it were alive, intelligent, and strategic. The children no longer merely gathered ash, they manipulated terrain, reshaping towns, drawing survivors into traps, forcing groups together only to separate and consume them. Rebecca stood at the center, observing. Her hum now penetrated the minds of anyone within miles. It was no longer a lullaby. It was a command. The living began to follow patterns they did not understand, marching into the ash willingly, believing it to be salvation. Resistance was rare and brief. Where it occurred, the choir adapted, feeding the ritual's strength. The world begins to listen. News reached regions beyond the immediate path of destruction. Stories emerged of blackened fog rolling across hills, of ash falling in cities that had not yet been touched directly, of children wandering streets in perfect silence, and of adults succumbing to unseen compulsion. Military detachments attempting to intercept the expansion reported hearing the lullaby in their sleep, feeling compelled to halt movements, even desert posts, to avoid confrontation. Rebecca's presence was felt in every incident. Even when she was miles away, the Ashen Choir obeyed her unseen hand. The ritual had become self-propagating, learning, adapting, expanding its reach, and consuming all human resistance. The cliffhanger, humanity's choice. By the chapter's close, the scale of the Ashen Apocalypse was clear. Entire regions were either lost or on the brink of vanishing. Survivors gathered in desperate enclaves, trying to understand the logic of the ash, the lullaby, and the choir. Alonso, writing by candlelight in one such hideout, noted with grim clarity, "If this continues, the Ashen Choir will consume more than just towns. It will rewrite the land, the mines, the very laws of life. And yet, we cannot leave Rebecca alive. She is the vessel, the conductor, the key. To stop this, someone must confront her. But who will survive the valley to reach her? And who will be lost in the ash before that moment arrives?" The chapter ends with survivors sighting a distant fog bank rising over the horizon, moving faster than wind, carrying the hum of the Ashen Choir. It was a sound that promised the world itself would soon hear the lullaby, and that the harvest was far from complete. The survivors approached Wither's Hollow under a sky choked with ash. The valley had become a black maw, rising against the horizon, swallowing the last vestiges of moonlight. Every step toward the heart of the ritual carried the weight of despair, yet there was no choice. To stop the Ashen Choir, or to witness humanity's collapse, they had to confront Rebecca. Elias Thorne, the militia sergeant, led the group. Father Alonso followed, clutching his crucifix, and a tome filled with notes on the ash, the choir, and the patterns of the ritual. Others included Marybeth Lorne, hardened by the loss of her child, and a handful of remaining townsfolk who had evaded abduction. They moved in silence, knowing the fog itself listened, that the ash recorded every heartbeat, every whisper. The valley's threshold. Upon entering the valley, the air changed. The fog thickened, forming columns and spirals, moving against the wind. Shadows of children flickered along the edges of vision, only to vanish when looked at directly. The earth beneath their boots was brittle and blackened, etched with geometric patterns that pulsed faintly, as though alive. Each step they took triggered a resonance in the ash, a low hum that matched the lullaby Rebecca had begun all those months ago. Father Alonso whispered prayers, but the words were drowned by a countervailing sound. The hum, low and insistent, vibrating the bones and minds of those who heard it. Even Thorne felt the compulsion to turn back, to abandon the mission, yet a grim determination forced him forward. They had come too far to retreat. First, contact. Rebecca appeared before them, emerging from the fog like a wraith. She was taller, older than before, yet retained the form of a child. Her dress flowed like smoke, her hair tangled but strangely ceremonial. Her eyes were voids reflecting the blackened valley, and her lips moved in silent harmony with the lullaby. The survivors froze. They realized instantly, this was no longer a girl. They faced the conductor of the ritual itself. The children of the Ashen Choir surrounded her, hundreds of spectral forms moving with perfect coordination. Each flicker of their limbs, each glance from their voided eyes, radiated the valley's will. Thorne signaled for weapons to be raised, but as they did, tendrils of ash struck like lightning, sweeping rifles aside, encasing arms and legs. Those caught screamed, voices layered with the choir, echoing unnaturally before silence claimed them. Marybeth fell to her knees, clutching at her chest as visions assaulted her mind. She saw her child, lost in fog, reaching out through layers of black smoke. The lullaby's hum became tangible, a force that bent the mind, urging submission. Alonso's prayers created only momentary resistance. The ash adjusted, pulsing with an intelligence that seemed to anticipate his every word. The ritual nears completion. Rebecca's humming intensified. The geometric patterns beneath her feet glowed faintly, pulsating in a sequence that hinted at a final phase. Father Alonso realized that every disappearance, every act of compulsion, had been preparing the valley for this moment. 13 burials, countless towns consumed, the ritual was ready to complete. The survivors understood the stakes. If the ritual finished, the Ashen Choir would expand uncontrollably beyond the valley, into the world, bending reality itself to its will. But the valley allowed them one choice: confront Rebecca directly or retreat and watch the world succumb. Thorn's hand tightened around his weapon. "We end this here," he said. The confrontation Thorn and the others advanced cautiously. The ash writhed, forming shapes that mimicked their movements, attempting to disorient, to delay. The children's voices layered over the lullaby, forming dissonant harmonics that pressed upon their minds. Alonso called upon divine authority, striking crucifixes into the ash, chanting litanies, but the effect was minimal. The ritual had become its own deity. Suddenly, Rebecca lifted her hands. The ash responded instantly, forming walls, barriers, and spirals. The survivors found themselves in a maze, the floor shifting beneath their feet, the fog forming new corridors. The lullaby's hum penetrated deeply, filling thoughts with visions of death and despair. Some screamed, some fell to their knees, but Thorn and Alonso pressed onward. At the center of the shifting maze, they finally confronted Rebecca. Her voice rose above the hum, a melodic, impossible sound, felt more than heard. "You cannot stop what has been written," she intoned. "You cannot unmake the choir, but you may choose to join or be consumed." Moral dilemma. The survivors faced a choice no human should bear. Each step closer risked death or corruption. The lullaby urged submission. The children of the choir, embodiments of the lost and the dead, reached with hands that promised comfort yet delivered control. Marybeth trembled, visions of her lost child merging with the choir. Alonso faltered, realizing that even the act of confronting Rebecca risked corruption. Her influence reached beyond flesh, into memory, into soul. Thorn raised his rifle. He understood what had to be done: disrupt the ritual at its source. The geometric patterns beneath Rebecca's feet were both the conductor's stage and the key to the ritual. If destroyed, the choir might falter. But the attempt meant approaching Rebecca, exposing themselves to the full power of the valley's mind. The assault Thorn and Alonso advanced. Ash surged, tendrils striking, twisting around limbs, attempting to drag them into the choir. Marybeth followed, clutching a makeshift holy relic, chanting prayers with faltering voice. Rebecca did not flee or resist. She only hummed, and the ash adapted instantly. The choir multiplied, closing off escape routes, shaping the fog into walls and ceilings. The survivors fought desperately. Bullets passed through smoke, flames flickered and died mid-air, and the ash writhed like living snakes. Yet Thorn reached the center, plunging a firebrand into the geometric pattern beneath Rebecca's feet. The ash recoiled, screaming, and the humming faltered momentarily. Rebecca's eyes widened, not with fear, but recognition. The ritual reacted violently, the ash exploding outward, striking the survivors, tearing at limbs, twisting flesh with unnatural force. Thorn and Marybeth were thrown back, burning but alive. Alonso cried out prayers, pounding crucifix into the ash, holding on for faith against despair. Cliffhanger. The chapter closes as the ash begins to converge again, forming a massive vortex around Rebecca, the choir growing exponentially. The firebrand smoulders in the geometric pattern, disrupting the ritual partially, but the valley resists, as if alive. Rebecca's hum rises to an unbearable crescendo, echoing in minds and bones alike. The survivors are battered, near collapse, yet still conscious. Thorn whispers to Alonso, "We may have slowed it, but the valley isn't done. She isn't done. And the choir, they are listening." The final panel of horror. The ash swirls faster, the children's silhouettes multiplying, and Rebecca, priestess and conductor, lifts her hands to the sky. The ritual teeters on completion, and the world beyond Wither's Hollow waits unknowingly for the next note of the ashen choir. The valley trembled beneath the weight of its own consciousness. Wither's Hollow had become more than a place. It was a mind, an intelligence wrought from ash, memory, and song. The ashen choir pulsed with energy, a living symphony that reached into the minds of every survivor, every fleeing child, every distant witness who had glimpsed its whispers. The lullaby, once a simple, haunting melody, had transformed into a cacophony of intention, a force shaping reality itself. Thorn, Alonso, and Mary Beth stood at the edge of the final clearing, hearts pounding, breaths shallow, bodies bruised and singed from the valley's relentless assault. Around them, the fog swirled violently, carrying hundreds of spectral children, their hollow eyes reflecting worlds beyond comprehension. And at the center, as always, Rebecca. No longer merely a child, she was now the embodiment of the ritual, standing amid a maelstrom of ash, her voice rising in a tone that resonated through bone and mind alike. The ritual's climax. The geometric patterns beneath Rebecca's feet glowed with a malevolent luminescence. Each line, spiral, and glyph pulsed in time with the choir, every note a command of creation and destruction. Father Alonso realized the horrifying truth. The ritual was reaching its apex, the point at which the valley would consume the living and remold the land into its own design. The world beyond the valley would be rewritten if it completed. Thorn gripped the firebrand that had smoldered in Chapter 14, now glowing with a mix of oil and alchemical mixture intended to disrupt the patterns. "We end this here," he said, voice trembling but resolute. Mary Beth tightened her grip on a relic of her lost child, chanting prayers that mingled with the discordant hum of the valley. Alonso prepared the final invocation, a litany meant to sever the link between the conductor and her choir. The assault on the conductor. As they advanced, the ashen choir reacted instantly. Tendrils of ash lashed out like living whips, tearing at limbs, twisting flesh, and burning memory. Shadows of the missing children darted between the fog, mimicking survivors' movements, forcing hesitation, inducing fear. The lullaby was no longer just sound. It was a force, pressing on their minds, bending their will, a psychic hammer threatening to shatter sanity. Thorn thrust the firebrand into the glowing glyphs beneath Rebecca. The ash recoiled, shrieking in impossible frequencies. Sparks and fragments of ash rose like flares, temporarily dispersing the choir, yet Rebecca remained, hovering above the vortex, her hum escalating to an unbearable pitch. The valley itself seemed to resist, the ground heaving, trees bending in unnatural curves, air warping around the ritual's epicenter. Alonso advanced, pounding crucifix into the ground, chanting the final verses of the litany. Each word he spoke caused the ash to convulse, flickering between solid and ephemeral forms. Mary Beth, channeling every ounce of grief and determination, shouted the name of her lost child into the void, a psychic beacon cutting through the choir's melody. The ritual faltered, but not without a cost. Pyrrhic victory. The patterns beneath Rebecca ignited in a conflagration of energy, the ash screaming in fury. A shockwave of light and heat tore through the valley. The choir scattered, some bodies vanishing completely, others frozen mid-motion, turned into statues of ash and bone. Rebecca's form shimmered, then cracked, revealing glimpses of the girl who had once been human, lost and trapped within the ritual's construct. Thorn, Alonso, and Mary Beth were thrown backward by the explosion. When they rose, the valley was eerily silent. The ashen choir had dissipated, The fog reduced to a thin layer of dust, and the geometric patterns were charred remnants of their former brilliance. For a moment, victory seemed possible, yet the silence was deceptive. Alonso noticed movement in the ash, faint but deliberate. Shapes, small and skeletal, shifted just beyond the threshold of sight. The choir was not entirely destroyed. It had been fractured, delayed, contained, but not eradicated. Rebecca's influence lingered in the valley, and in the minds of the survivors. Marybeth collapsed, weeping, having glimpsed her child's face in the dissipating fog. Thorn surveyed the valley, understanding that the ritual's partial disruption had cost them everything: allies lost, bodies mangled or consumed, and the psychological toll indelible. Humanity had survived, but only barely, and the cost would echo forever. Lingering horror. Father Alonso whispered the final observation into his journal. The valley waits. The ritual may be broken, yet its intent persists. The ashen choir listens, learns, and endures. Rebecca remains, though fragmented, a seed of what it once was. Wherever ash drifts, a note of the lullaby may awaken, and with it, the harvest begins anew. We are not safe. We are merely postponed. The survivors retreated from the valley, each step taking them further from immediate danger, but deeper into despair. The world beyond Wither's Hollow remained oblivious to the near apocalypse that had occurred, but reports of strange fogs, missing children, and whispering winds began to emerge. The lullaby, though faint, had travelled. The choir's influence was no longer bound to a single location. Thorn, hardened by loss and terror, understood a truth too vast for comfort. The ashen choir was not simply a curse or a ritual. It was a force, and forces of that magnitude do not die. They only wait, dormant, growing, watching, and listening. The valley had spoken, and the world had not yet answered. The final image. As the survivors left the perimeter of Wither's Hollow, the valley seemed to sigh. A swirl of ash lifted briefly into the sky, forming the faint outline of a child's face. Rebecca's face, smiling, both innocent and impossibly old. The wind carried a whisper, faint but unmistakable. The lullaby had not ended. It had only paused, waiting for the next note, the next victim, the next town to fall silent. The chapter, and the story, ends with the echo of that whisper, lingering in the minds of both survivors and audience alike. The ash remembers. The song continues. The choir will return. The valley remains, silent to the eye, but alive to the mind, a cosmic stinger that hints at the inevitable expansion of horror beyond the boundaries of Wither's Hollow. Humanity has survived the night, but the lullaby is eternal.